Good evening and welcome to Scotland at 7 on Thursday, the 25th of November. My name is Maggie Lennon and I'll start the programme as usual with the up-to-date coronavirus statistics. As of 2 o'clock today, a total of 3,647,886 people in Scotland have been tested through the NHS Scotland labs and UK government regional testing centres since the start of the pandemic. Of these, 2,932,487 have been confirmed negative and 715,399 have tested positive. There are 2,932 new cases of COVID-19 confirmed by a test, although not everyone with the virus will display symptoms and not all those with symptoms will be tested. There are 20 new reported deaths of people who have tested positive, and the number of patients in Scotland who have died from complications caused by the coronavirus infection now stands at 9,524. This number only includes those who have died having received a positive test for the virus in the previous 28 days. Of the people who have tested positive, 712 were in hospital last night, 61 of whom were in intensive care. As of 8 o'clock this morning, 4,342,107 people have received their first dose of the COVID-19 vaccination, and 3,942,927 had received their second, with 1,535,623 having received a third dose or booster. The latest UK daily figures show 144,433 patients who've tested positive for COVID-19 have sadly died from their illness, an increase of 147 since yesterday. This number refers to deaths in all settings, not just hospitals. I'm joined this evening by Margaret Young, who works for one of the Glasgow MPs, Anne McLaughlin, also a leading Scottish feminist and Women for Indie member, and Rachel Adamson, co-director of Zero Tolerance, a charity in Scotland that promotes equality for women in an attempt to halt gender violence. Most of the programme tonight is going to be a slightly unusual programme tonight. We're really going to concentrate on two main stories. One is the fact that today marks the International Day for the Elimination of Violence Against Women and the start of the UN 16 Days of Activism. We're also going to look at the issues around asylum and migrants in the UK following the tragic deaths in the Channel yesterday. But before we get to that, we've got one little story about COVID. And that's the announcement today that Scotland's contact tracing workforce will remain in place until September next year through a funding commitment of £33.1 million. The investment will secure almost 500 posts at local health boards around the country, as well as additional core tracing staff at the National Contact Centre and additional capacity from private suppliers to meet demand surges and ensure continuity in staffing levels in the months ahead. Work is already ongoing to identify the longer-term strategic approach to contact tracing and how the system will look as we learn to live with the virus. Health Secretary Humza Yousaf said, "Our contact tracing staff have played a vital role throughout the pandemic and we owe them a huge debt of gratitude for all their efforts." Margaret, I think it's fair to say that compared to contact tracing system down south, which of course has been plagued by accusations of cronyism and money being wasted and it frankly not working, the contact tracing system in Scotland has been quite a success. But I'm just wondering, as we get nearer normality, how many people, if they get that phone call or get that ping, do you think are actually going to bother to self-isolate? Are we becoming a bit complacent?
I think we could become complacent, but I think this commitment from the Scottish Government on sort of track and trace will help to keep people focused on that. You can see that with a commitment towards mask wearing. It's there's plenty of people in Scotland don't wear masks when they would be, or they definitely should be wearing them. But you see far more mask wearing in Scotland, and I think that will be regularly. People were regularly reminded to wear them, from whether it's the First Minister talking about it in adverts, and just getting used to taking a lateral flow test twice a week or in any other circumstances you need it, will just become part of our new normal.
Rachel, when do you think we will just accept that there's a certain level of the virus that we just have to live with, because we're never going to get rid of it, obviously, completely. Just today, for example, they've announced that they've found a new variant that they've only found in South Africa. They've not found very many people, but they're slightly concerned about it because it has 32 mutations. So the suggestion is that perhaps current vaccines might not work so well. But at what point do you think we just have to say, this is it, this is what we live with now?
Well, what a question. Um, I suppose from where I'm standing, it's important that we recognise the challenge that this has brought to the disproportionate impact that the pandemic has had on women, and ensure that if this is our new normal, that we recognise the burden that women face in terms of household chores, in terms of childcare, where they are disproportionately the people with these responsibilities, and recognise how much more challenging they are when you don't have the backup of alternative childcare should someone fall sick from COVID. So when do we have to just say this is the new normal? Well, as someone who is fighting patriarchy and fighting the status quo of the current situation in many different ways, I would say we can never just accept the exact circumstance. We need to keep trying to make things better.
Well, that leads us very nicely then to our first main story this evening, which, as I said, is to mark the International Day of Elimination of Violence Against Women. Scottish Parliament held a minute's silence today at Parliament for all women killed by men this year to mark that International Day. And the silence marked the start of the United Nations 16-day of activism. The UN reports that 1 in 3 women will be abused in their lifetime, and at times of crisis, like the pandemic, Rachel, as you've just said, and in times of conflict, humanitarian crisis, climate crisis, and disasters, the numbers rise. A new report from the UN, from UN Women, based on data from 13 countries, says that 2/3 of women either know women or are women themselves who have experienced some sort of violence, but that only 1 in 10 would think about reporting it to the police. So that's part of the problem, isn't it? I mean, obviously, we know in the UK we've had the horrific unveiling in the last few months of just how complicit some members of the police force have been in either not supporting women who've been victims of violence or actually perpetrators themselves. But is that one of the things that has to change, that women have to feel more confident in the justice system when they are themselves victims of violence or their families? Rachel?
It absolutely is. However, from where I'm standing, we need to think much more long term and go back to the root cause of the violence. It's too late for us to just focus on the justice system and ensuring that women feel empowered to come forward once they've already experienced the violence. Yes, absolutely. We need to invest money into ensuring that services are there to support women, that the justice system stops letting them down. But crucially, we actually need to tackle the problem at its source, and that is women's inequality, gender inequality. That is the reason that we have violence against women in our society. So yes, that we need to ensure that everything is there for when the violence does happen, but we need to do much, much more to make sure it never happens in the first place.
And what sort of things are Zero Tolerance doing then? Because promoting gender equality is key to your work. So what sort of things is Zero Tolerance doing at the moment?
So we have a range of pieces of work that are about promoting gender equality. We work with the media. So we have some guidelines on how to report accurately and sensitively on violence against women, because we know that the media plays a key role in shaping attitudes towards women and towards violence. And all too often we see those trivializing headlines that belittle women and belittle the situation. So we work with the media. We also work, a fair amount of our work is focused on children and young people, because it is never too early to start tackling gender stereotypes. Gender stereotypes are part of the cause of gender inequality, and that inequality causes violence against women. So, for example, we have recently conducted, in partnership with a range of nurseries, an audit of the books on their bookshelves, and found some staggeringly low numbers of books that have women in non-stereotypical roles. Very few, less than 1% had disabled characters in a significant role. So children need to see the society that reflects them. So it's important for disabled children to see themselves in those books, but also more broadly, other children need to see a range of diversity so that we can all understand that we all come from different places. So that's just a couple of the pieces of work that we do, because this needs to happen across society, children and young people with adults. We can all play our part.
Transforming social norms is obviously key, as is tackling poverty, but they're not easy things to do, nor are they going to happen quickly. I'm wondering if there has been any shift at all in the 30 years since the first International Day for elimination of violence against women. Has there been anything that you can perceive? And I think I'm right in saying that zero tolerance is 30 years old next year. So what have you seen? Where have you seen society move, or society's norms move in that 30 years that would suggest that things might get better?
That would suggest that things might get better. I can reflect on our world-leading Domestic Abuse Act. That has set I think I've heard others speak of it as a gold standard for what we should be looking for in terms of a law for domestic abuse. We now need to make sure that the justice system and police are trained in order to carry that out. But that gives me hope that we are making progress. I'm afraid there's still too much to do. And the pandemic, as we have already discussed, has set back women's equality. But I really want, on this day of the UN Day of Elimination of Violence Against Women, for everyone to reflect on what they can do. If we all play a part, we can shift those attitudes and the behavior that leads to this violence. Don't get me wrong, a lot more needs to happen at a structural level and at a societal level. I think we may have mentioned that there was the debate in Parliament this afternoon, and all those politicians and decision makers need to be making substantial changes to policies and practices throughout Scotland. But I don't want anyone to listen to this and think, oh, well, I'll leave it to them, because we all can play a part in tackling gender inequality.
Margaret, do you think there has been a shift in the public perception of people who are victims of violence, women who are victims of violence, at all, from, say, 30 years ago, or even in the last 10 years? Are people more understanding of the root causes and less likely to put the blame on the victims themselves, or are we still at that position?
I think, though, there's probably been a little bit of a shift, because I think there's more awareness, and having things like the domestic abuse bill and people being aware of that, and the understanding around coercive control that's coming to become something that people are becoming aware of. But attitudes, I don't know really how much they've changed in some respects, because people can pick, say, high profile cases and feel very shocked and very upset by them and want to see things change. But you only have to look at social media, and how often will you see comments about people victim blaming, or people maybe just not feeling confident that they can take that on. So I think there's still a very loud voice for the patriarchy and the people who support it. So I think we've got a long way to go, but I hope that we will see more changes. I think it's slow, but it's probably moved slightly in a more positive direction.
And do you think we need more survivor-based solutions and the voice of the survivors to be heard and survivors to be believed? Because I still think that often isn't the case.
I think for survivors to be believed is really important. And I think that lived experience is something that has to be part of it. But I don't think people who have survived violence should be the ones who have to make, to push that change. It's got to come from all parts of society. So lived experience, yeah, that's important voices that we must hear. And I don't mean that they shouldn't be a leading part of that, but it shouldn't be left to people who have experienced it to be the ones that have to be the people who change it. We should all be paying more attention and listening and understanding more.
Rachel was celebrating the legislation we have in Scotland, but today in Westminster, to mark the International Day for Elimination of Violence Against Women, SNP MP Gavin Newlands called on Boris Johnson to stop failing women and girls in the face of violence by ratifying the Istanbul Convention. The Istanbul Convention, officially known as Council of Europe Convention on Preventing and Combating Violence Against Women and Domestic Violence, is a regional human rights instrument that aims to protect women against all forms of violence and hold perpetrators accountable. The UK signed the Council of Europe's Convention on Violence Against Women and Domestic Violence almost 10 years ago, but is one of the few EU countries yet to ratify it, and therefore it's not legally binding by its provisions. Rachel, what difference would it make, do you think, if the UK was to ratify the Istanbul Convention?
By ratifying it and putting it into our laws, it would have a substantive impact on the lives of women. It would ensure that the government is legally bound to uphold our rights across a range of areas. I'm not a legal expert or an expert on this, but I know that we have been campaigning alongside all our sisters and sister organisations for this for a long time. I believe the Scottish Government have agreed to incorporate it into Scots law, but there's still a way to go to make sure that is implemented, to have that impact on women's lives.
One of the things that women, especially women in the public domain, and this may have happened to both of you, are acutely aware of is the increasing rise of misogynist behaviour towards them. It's like there's a backlash against women who are prepared to stand up and promote women's rights. Where do both of you stand on all of that and misogyny as a hate crime and the whole debate around that, Margaret?
Yeah, I mean, I think misogyny should be a hate crime, but I do agree that it should be a standalone issue, so that the way that it's been looked at the moment by the Scottish Government, and to bring through legislation specifically around that, I think it's been really important. And I think that also shows how seriously it's been taken, and we should continue to support what they're doing. We haven't seen obviously all the the everything yet about what will come out about that, but I do think that there needs to be legislation. It's not the only thing, it's part of what we need to do. But if you don't see your government taking things like this seriously, then you're starting on the back foot.
Well, Rachel, the Scottish Government has an independent working group to consider the most effective legal and other responses to misogynistic harm. So what would you like to see that working group come up with?
Pretty much what Margaret just said, a standalone crime. We know from international evidence that putting gender alongside other forms of equality group or protected characteristic doesn't work. Gender inequality, sexism, misogyny is so ingrained in our society that we don't notice it. And so women don't report it. So we want that standalone crime together with the appropriate training of police, awareness raising across society as to what it means to perpetrate a sexist crime. But I just think it's very telling that the international evidence shows us that doesn't work, that it doesn't work when you treat it as other hate crimes, because it's so ingrained in our society and we are all subject to those societal norms that we just don't even notice.
Yeah, and I sometimes get quite frustrated when women's issues get linked to other equalities, which are to help promote the equality of minorities. Women are not the minority, women are the majority of people in the world. And I think sometimes people forget that. It's something else that would help promote a different legislative approach to women's issues, and especially misogyny, is about what about improving women's participation in politics and public life? Something that I think a lot of women would like to see happen, and a lot of women's groups in Scotland are campaigning for and trying to promote. But I come back to the horrific abuse that many women in public life receive, especially in social media. But would you like to see some major campaigns to get more women involved in public life and to take up elected positions? Margaret.
Absolutely. Oh, sorry.
Well, I'll come to you in a minute,
Fine.
Rachel. Margaret first.
Well, I agree with Rachel there, absolutely. And I think as well, it's it, at the moment, I know at Westminster and the Women Equalities Committee, they have been looking at the treatment of MPs, and there is some work being done there on that. But it's that thing that if you're an elected rep and you're a woman, you'll serve for a shorter length of time usually than if you're a man. Not only maybe because of other circumstances around maybe caring responsibilities, but simply down to the abuse that you get. It's an intersectional issue as well. So if you're a black or ethnic minority woman, you'll get more abuse. If you're disabled, you'll get more abuse. If you're LGBT, you'll get more abuse. So we do need to look at it from an intersectional point, but but overall, it's just nothing is really happening. Nobody's taking it seriously enough. Nobody, big social media firms are doing nothing to do it, and that's before we look at all the sort of alt-right that's behind a lot of this. So there's a lot of work needs to be done, and as you say, not just elected reps, but also women in public life in other areas. And the amount of abuse that people get, I don't think they believe the amount of abuse. And I work, as you said, for Anne McLaughlin, and there's not a week goes by when I have to consider what I need to report to the police, just coming in via things like emails. So, and every single woman who is an elected rep gets abuse, and it's not a hierarchy. It's not, this one get this one bad, or that one get that one bad. It's not like that. There are people, as I say, particularly if you are black, ethnic minority, etc., that will get more abuse, but every single one of them does. And actually something that really frustrates me is when people ask people like Nicola Sturgeon to call out for an elected rep who's a woman and who has a platform, because people like Nicola Sturgeon call out for all women every day not to get abused. And I do think we need to be aware of that. It's we need to call out for all women in all parts of life, but certainly we won't get more women to be at the decision-making tables and be there for a length of time where they can use their experience if we don't if we don't do something about this.
And Rachel, I'm sorry I cut you off as you were about to start. I'm assuming you agree with Margaret, but you might have some other points you want to make on this.
Sure, I was enthusiastically agreeing that we need to see more women in positions of power. That for too long society has been shaped by those who are in power, and they are typically white men, able-bodied. I could go on. We need diversity in our decision making, and that will help to shape the society that we need. One thing that I really did want to bring in that I don't think we've really mentioned so far this evening, and forgive me if I'm jumping ahead, but it is the particular role of men that I think we talk about women's issues, and that by default then means that we often talk about women's roles. And I think it's really important that we recognise that men are shaped by the society that we're in. So this isn't about making all men feel bad, but it is about asking all men to step up and play their part. So, not to take us back to too horrendous a time, but we'll all remember the locker room chat ahead of Trump coming to power, and the fact that he still got into power, and that there's this idea that it's just banter. And it's never just banter. Women's lives depend on us fixing this and fixing the attitudes and behaviour that lead to women's inequality, that then leads to the violence against them. So I speak a lot about the fact that we can all play our part, but I think it's really important when you're having a conversation like this to really make sure that it's not just women who are going, oh, well, what more can I do? Because when it actually comes to our safety, it shouldn't be on us. It should be on men, and it should be on society to make those changes so that we feel safe and we don't have to change our behaviour.
In that case, what do you make of the new, I don't know if you've seen it, but the new, I think it's Police Scotland who are behind the new television campaign, which is exactly that, which is asking men that they themselves may not have ever committed violence or be likely to commit violence, but they will know men who have talked about women in such a way that suggests that these women are unsafe or disrespectful, and it's about calling them out. So have you seen that at all, Rachel? It's not been on television very much. I've only caught it, I think, a couple of times. But do you think that sort of approach, that very public approach, where you're saying to men, you are not necessarily part of the problem, but you are most definitely part of the solution. Do you think that's the right approach? Do you think that can have some effect?
It can. I've certainly seen conversations going on around that campaign, and it's got people talking. However, we know to change attitudes does rely on relationships. It's about cultivating and trust and relationships between individuals and between groups and between communities. So people are sharing information and not feeling too lectured at. So whilst, yes, there is absolutely a place for really uncompromising public campaigns, and I think we need more of them, but we also need to think, but how can we build bridges and get people talking to one another and understanding where each other are coming from? Because ultimately the stats I fall back on time and time again are that 4 out of 5 violent crimes in Scotland are perpetrated by men. 4 out of 5 domestic abuse incidents reported to Police Scotland had a female victim and a male perpetrator. So we're talking about male violence here. And yes, there is a lot on men, men perpetrating violence on men. But there's also the violence that I'm particularly focused on, which is the violence that is perpetrated on women because they're women, and it's predominantly perpetrated by men. So we need to have this conversation about the role that men can play.
And it is right, Margaret, it needs called out, isn't it? Because too often we hear that as a defensive line. Oh, well, what about men? There's violence against men. Or even worse, when women have been calling out male violence this summer, what you've heard back from a lot of men is it's not all men. The point is, as a woman, you don't know who the violent men are. You don't know if the man you're talking to is likely to be violent or has been violent. So what else do you think, Margaret, needs to be done in order to persuade our men, our young men in particular, our sons, to really own this issue?
I think two parts. One, if you look at the Police Scotland campaign, one thing that I've reflected on that, because we do say not all men, we can't tell. Imagine sitting there and saying we can't tell what men will be violent towards us. It should be obvious. But, one thing that I reflected is this something, do men feel uncomfortable about calling out the behaviour of other men? And, the thing that struck me is look at the Tartan Army, roughly most of them are men. They go abroad, they have a good drink, but they look after each other and say that's not acceptable. So we need to encourage that type of chat amongst men so that they feel that they are going to speak out and say, well, that's not acceptable. That's not an acceptable way to behave or to talk or whatever else. In terms of younger people, I think when we look at, and I would say from before school, from they're very small, we need to give people and boys, in this case, I suppose mostly, ways to manage how they feel. When I worked with children and young people, I can remember a boy who got into a fight at school saying to me, I know violence is wrong, but I don't know how to handle this situation when people are calling me names. Because if I don't hit them back, these other boys, then they'll continue to do that. And that's the kind of world we live in. And that's a very simple example. I mean, I don't know either of you watched that the programme on rape culture in schools and about pornography and the access that boys have to that and the entitlement they think they have to girls' bodies. Now, I'm not pushing more things onto schools. I know they're really busy, but that's the culture that we're living in. So it's no surprise that men carry that on, even if they understand the pornography is not like real life when they get older, and disappointed, no doubt.
Rachel, as I said at the beginning of the story, this is the start of the 16 days of activism. What sorts of things can we expect to see in the next 16 days? And how can people get involved? How can people contribute to this debate and raise awareness?
There will be a range of activities going on across Scotland. I don't actually have any to hand, other than I do know that an event is going on in Glasgow next Friday to honour the women killed by through honour-based violence. So I'd encourage people to look at Amina's website for more details on that. But there'll be a range of these kind of events that it's about showing solidarity with those who have been who are survivors or who have died, but also looking to the future and saying, come on, it's 2021, time for change and seismic change.
And Margaret, are you involved in any events going on in Glasgow in the next 16 days that you'd particularly highlight?
I'm a bit like Rachel. I can't tell you exact dates. I think within our office we'll be, we've already been highlighting today, around the safe space it is to come and speak in our office if you're a constituent and you're a woman and you've had a problem with violence from men, and the fact that you won't have to repeat your story over and over again. You'll speak to one person and you'll not have to repeat that story, because that reliving the trauma is something that's we need to avoid, and that happens too often with services for women. But we will be active and we'll be busy every day.
What I think we all can do is continue to raise awareness amongst our friends and our family and our own circle, and make sure that when men come out with the sort of thing, that it's not all men. Don't let them away with that. Just point out some of the issues we've been raising tonight. The statistics that I mentioned at the beginning really are horrific. Just to remind you, 1 in 3 women, that's a third of women in the world, will suffer violence from men at some point in their life, and most won't go on and report it. It can only have been me that found the crocodile tears of the Prime Minister and Home Secretary Priti Patel over the tragic deaths yesterday in the English Channel somewhat offensive, especially when they have threatened those who would save people from the English Channel with criminality, and they have presided over the most hostile UK environment that I've known for many a year in regards refugees and migrants. Margaret, I know that you advise Anne McLaughlin specifically on asylum and migrant issues. I can imagine you must have been as shocked as anyone yesterday with the news of the deaths in the Channel.
Yeah, I mean, I think the first thing, I know it's unlikely that the family and friends of these people that have died and all the other people who have died will be listening. But first of all, condolences to all of them, because these are people. They're not statistics, and it's so important that we don't dehumanise them. It's not surprising in some way that more people died, because the government are cutting down the routes available, what they would call the legal routes available for people to come to the UK. And if you look at the figures, this year so far, around 25,700 people have already made that crossing, which is 3 times what the figure was for last year, and that's not because there's been an increase in the amount of asylum claims, because that's not changed. It's the routes that they can come here by that have changed. So basically, the government are enabling people trafficking and deaths by what they're doing.
And yes, and I mean, this has now become yet another political row. It's been a political football. It's an absolute, it's disgusting. It's become this political football between France and the UK, and both sides blaming each other, saying it's your responsibility to sort this out. The fact of the matter is, both Britain and France treat asylum seekers and migrants with extreme brutality. They think that that's the way to fix it. And as you've just said, it absolutely is not. The Spectator's editorial today was really humane and was talking exactly about that, Margaret, about the fact that there are not enough safe routes. And the reality is, in a world that is full of inequalities, and we'll come back to that inequality stuff in a minute with you, Rachel, in a world that is full of inequalities, in a world where there are parts of the world where people lead a reasonably safe, reasonably decent life and have security against people that don't, you are always going to find that people want to move to find that security and safety that they're entitled to as human beings. And in that case, migration isn't new. People have been moving around the world forever. And if we sort out what's happening in the English Channel, Margaret, all that's likely to happen is that people will end up dying on other beaches in other parts of the world. And just because we can't see them doesn't mean it goes away. So what do you think? What would you like to see happen? Does the law need to change? Does the UN Convention of Refugees need to change? Does there need to be a change in attitude to Fortress Europe? Is it just stopping invading countries? What do we need to do to tackle, one, the root causes and make safer legal routes more available? And I know that's a very big question.
So to look at what else can we do? We hear a lot about economic migrants, for example, as if they're not somehow, worthy of coming here. But the reason why, obviously most people who come, it's either because their country's in a state of war or collapse, or they're being persecuted because of their beliefs in the country that they come from. But there are people who come here seeking asylum because their livelihood has disappeared in their country, quite often because of climate change, which has meant they either can't grow the crops, for example, or farm the land that they used to have, or they can't have the industry that they used to have because it relied on something they no longer get, like water. And the reason why those things have changed is because of demands from the Western world, usually. And they come here because we caused the problem, and they're looking for us to help find a solution to it. They're desperate because their livelihood's gone and they'll die if they don't do something about it. And we caused the problem, so they want to come here. So there's big questions around climate change and about consumption that we need to deal with to stop certain types of migration and to make sure that people can live a decent life where they are. You talked about, stop invading countries. Yes, clearly that's not something that's helpful. But also the safe and legal routes. Yes, if you cut down all the routes and you say there's none there, then people will have to use illegal routes, as they would call them, because crossing the channel shouldn't be something that you drown. You should be able to get on a train or get on a ferry or whatever way you want to come in here and to be able to claim asylum. Now, it may get turned down because of a whole lot of different reasons. You may be told you can't make the claim here, but of course the UK tore up Dublin 3. It tore up all the agreements it had with the EU when Brexit happened, and we don't actually, as the UK or the UK government, they don't have the right just to say, "Oh, we won't take people." It's someone else's responsibility. And during the Nationality and Borders Bill committee, that was put forward to them all the time. But of course, hey ho, they don't mind. And sadly, the UK is going the way of trying to make people illegal. I don't even really understand that concept. But what we need to do is to have a fair and a humane system that gives people time to let people know why they've come. Sometimes it's around having the support system there if they're traumatized, so that they can, they can talk. They can talk to people and feel that they're safe to do so. It's not about locking people up in detention centres or sending them offshore. That won't change anything except to make life worse for those people. Look at Australia, look at Greece. They've both used those systems. They've both failed, and nowhere has used those systems that the UK government have said that they're going to bring in and have had any success with them.
Rachel, you made a very clear case and that why inequality is at the root of violence against women, and why women's equality has to be addressed in order for violence against women to reduce or hopefully stop altogether. I think what we can understand within the whole case of international migration and global movements of people is about inequality too. It's about a power imbalance between those that have no power and those that do. But that is made even doubly difficult for women who are caught up in this position. The vast majority of women who seek asylum have been victims of either sexual or physical violence themselves. Now, the international law, and you don't need to know what the international law is in order to answer this question, but the international law that affects asylum is not gendered in any way. There is no specific reference or acknowledgement to the issues that affect women who are claiming asylum. What do you make of that? Are you surprised to learn that, or did you know that already?
That is no surprise to anyone working in the field of gender inequality, I'm afraid. We all too often see policies, practices, laws, ways of working that come from one particular viewpoint, and that tends to be very white, very male, and a very particular point of view. And I think so many of the problems that we face stem from the same kind of root causes, colonialism, that has put white people in some way as holding the power. Capitalism works on a class system that makes sure some people get all the money while the others do all the work. Patriarchy, again, that imbalance of power. All these interlocking systems create this world of inequality, and we are seeing some of the consequences of that in the sad scenes that we see today. But I would also emphasize that there are certain times when this captures the media and the public's attention. We see the same thing with certain cases of violence against women, certain murders capture attention. But this is happening every day. And every day we need to be taking steps to try and break down those interlocking power systems that I've been talking about. And I know they're all big words, but actually, if we go back to some of the smaller words that I used earlier about banter, everyone knows what banter looks like, and everyone can play a role to tackle
it. Margaret, I know that you were writing today on social media about the narrative that we would expect to hear from the Conservative government following yesterday's disaster. So if you had the Prime Minister in front of you now, what would you say to him about his lies? How would you prove that that's what they were, just lies and being at least economical with the truth?
I mean, it's such a hard question, that, because they are presented with their lies in Parliament and they don't care. They just don't care, because they just are carrying on and doing what they're wanting to do. But if we assume there was a Prime Minister there who cared enough to listen to other points of view, I think is probably the way to look at it. I think there's so many unanswered questions about about what's happening, even looking at the new bill again, a lot of that has just got placeholders in to say the Secretary of State can decide. There's not any, there's nothing there. They're very hard to pin down and things. So one of the things I was writing about today was around Afghanistan and people who've come here, obviously through the evacuation, or who are waiting for applications to be read. So there's two schemes. There's the one that I think people know about, where people who've worked with the UK government in Afghanistan in some form can apply to come to the UK. And most of the people who came in the summer, that is how they got here. They were almost invited to the airport. And we've told there's this other scheme, which is the one which is the 20,000 people that were announced that would be allowed to come, and they would get indefinite leave to remain as well. And they were supposed to be women, or people who opposed the Taliban quite publicly, maybe because of the positions that they were in, LGBT people. But actually, when you drill down into that, it never opened. That scheme's never opened. And I'm not actually convinced it would. So I would ask the Prime Minister if that scheme will ever open. But the thing about that is Kevin Foster, the Immigration Minister, was on the television on BBC today, and he said 16,000 people came in through the evacuation. Now, they're all supposed to be people who came in because they already qualified, but what they're doing is they're moving some of those people to be part of this 20,000 people. And so we won't be taking another 20,000 plus the 12,000 people who are still waiting for their applications to be read from that first scheme. Then they're going to take the people who they gave the invitations to under the ARAP scheme that is open, and they're going to offer them this other 20,000 people. So once again, unusually women are getting bumped down this line, and then they're going to work with UNHCR for the rest of them, but they don't actually have any plan about how people would get out of Afghanistan. And at the moment, people can't get their passports. I know people there have been told by the Taliban they can come and collect their passports, but people are too scared to do it. I know someone this week that's in that situation in Afghanistan, and they are just trying to psych out getting someone else to go for them. But of course, no one wants to go. But I would ask them about that, why announce these things? And they're just going to jiggle these figures about, and they're going to say, we let 16,000 people in, and now we're going to let in another 20,000 people. But they will be mostly the same people, and they'll just call them out in two different forms. So I would like to know that, but it's very hard to pin them down to know how you could ask them. And I think maybe the second thing would be, when we're, especially today, when we're particularly talking about women, with their new bill that they're bringing in, that means you've got no right to family reunion. Now, we know that often it is men who come as the asylum seeker, because although men are in a huge amount of danger, there's certain aspects of that danger that it's at least perceived that they won't suffer as badly as women. And then if they get their asylum claim granted, they apply for family reunion with their wife or their partner and children if they've got children. But now you won't be able to do that. So there will be more women and children having to come in these dangerous routes, because they will have no choice but to come and present themselves, if they're in any way, shape or form able to travel.
And actually, as well, with the fact that the first scheme, the ARAP scheme, which was aimed at Afghanis who were working with the British government as interpreters or drivers or whatever, who are the first wave of resettled Afghanis to come. You're right, most of the claimants, the main claimants, are men, because they were the ones working with the British government. Some of them have got British citizenship, but their families don't. So actually, there's no clear indication what's going to happen to the families who are here. And given the hostile environment that the British government has created against giving people leave to remain, there's a real concern that the families might not get to stay, or they might get to stay for a very limited period, encouraging people to go back to Afghanistan. And in the meantime, they're all caught in this kind of hiatus That's why they're all still housed in these bridging hotels, because they can't really move on, because some of the people who are here have got rights, but lots of them who are here don't have rights. And as you say, Margaret, it's the women that suffer. And there seems to be no kind of way through this, really. Rachel, one of the things that both the French and the British government have come out and said today, in relation specifically to yesterday's tragic drownings, is that the main responsibility lies with the people smugglers. Is that a correct understanding of the issue? Or where does the responsibility really lie?
I think it's twofold. If we're looking at individuals, then it's certainly more with the smugglers than any of the messaging that you sometimes hear about. Well, people are making choices to get on boats or whatever. So I would firmly pin blame there. However, I think we need to look at a much higher and global level than that, at the systems that have been put in place, at the inequality that we see across the world, that, as we've already said, leaves people in no choice, but they have to leave the country that they're in. And they are the issues that we need to solve. And the blame for that lies firmly with governments and decision makers across the globe. I don't know enough about immigration and the specifics of the situations we're talking about. But I know that it's never enough just to talk about individual actions. We need to look at that global interaction of systems, and what steps governments can be taking to make the world safer for the most vulnerable.
Margaret, you've mentioned several times tonight the new Nationality and Borders Bill. This is a major new piece of legislation, the biggest piece of legislation to affect immigration, I think, in maybe 10 years. It is effectively going to rip up the agreement that Britain has with the UNHCR. It's going to create a two-tier asylum system. So asylum seekers that come in and apply for asylum, that may actually end up stopping altogether, in respect and in preference for a resettlement scheme where the government cherry pick people that they want to come in from various camps around the world. Now, that's the system that tends to operate in places like Australia and New Zealand and the United States and Canada, places which are geographically quite far away from the trouble spots, not 21 miles offshore from the rest of Europe, which is obviously has a system that is based on the traditional asylum routes, as well as the two-tier system that is being proposed. What else, and specifically from the Nationality and Borders Bill, worries you, specifically in terms of the impact on women?
I think part of what I was saying around the fact that there will probably be more women are involved in illegal people smuggling, and we know that women are more likely to be, sent into prostitution or slavery as well, and also there will be far more undocumented people who come to the UK, and that will mean that there's more undocumented women, and they're more likely to be targeted by organised crime, and they're more likely to become homeless. I think the other thing, and I don't like to sort of talk about, women are the ones that care, because clearly men care just as much about their families, and I don't mean it like that. But they're being asked to more put their children at risk as well. And I think for a lot of women, they're all, that's going to be a particular extra stress on them, especially if they've got young children, and the fact that they could be split up from them. Because one of the things that they're looking at in this bill, and that they're saying that they're going to bring it in, is that there's going to be an assumption that if you've got someone who comes into the UK and they don't look like a child, then they'll be put into an adult, well, probably a detention centre that they're going to be put into or offshored, and they could be split up from their children. I mean, there are some things that they're talking about doing if they can prove their age, but like forced X-rays of children's teeth so that they can prove that the children are a certain age, and the other part of it as well, and I know this is slightly off what you were saying, is, one of the things is they're going to prosecute children. They said over the age of 10 years because that's the age of criminal responsibility in England. Well, we know from next month the criminal responsibility in Scotland is going to be 12 years. So, I mean, how's that going to work? I'm hoping Scotland will, this bill runs roughshod across devolution in many different layers, but I'm hoping that that's something that Scotland can maybe take a slightly different path on how it deals with children.
I think that is one of that and also the issues of trafficking, because that also cuts
Yeah.
across Scottish law. That there might, but it is
Mhm.
difficult to know which law will trump whatever. You mentioned there children. I heard something today because obviously this is I'm suggesting that there's this new bill coming in and that the current system is fine. Thank you very much until this new bill comes in. There's so much wrong with the current system, and I heard today two things that alarmed me. A lot of unaccompanied minors, that is children who come here without an attached parent, just because of the way they come into the country, have been living unhoused in Kent and other parts of the south coast. I understand that Kent, as a county, is either unable to or is unwilling to act as a corporate parent, and therefore the Home Office have said these children, these unaccompanied children, will have to be dispersed around the UK, and they were asking for a voluntary transit system where local authorities would agree to take some. And several Scottish local authorities agreed to take some, mostly in the Central Belt, in big cities where there were quite a lot of facilities and where there were other services. Apparently on Tuesday of this week, the Home Office have said they're ripping up the voluntary nature and they're making it mandatory. Every single local authority in the United Kingdom will have to take unaccompanied minors. There's no getting out of it. If your looked after children's services have no space and no room, that's not an excuse. So there's no idea where these children are going to be, vulnerable children, where they're going to be looked after. My understanding is for every 650 adult asylum seekers dispersed to Scotland, we'll get 44 unaccompanied minor children. We've 32 local authorities. So you actually have the position you might have the odd unaccompanied child in Shetland, in Orkney, in the Western Isles, remote rural areas, far away from services, far away from people that speak their language, far away from people that look like them. That's inhuman, surely, Margaret.
Oh no, absolutely, and this idea as well that we need to do as well. I heard Priti Patel talking about it about places like Kent, they're overrun, whether it's children or whether it's adults. I mean, if you actually look at, say, London, and there's asylum seekers there, there's 9 per 10,000 members of the population, you should say, sorry, and it's 56 in Glasgow. And whilst it's good that there's services and I know that there's a lot of people want to come to Glasgow after they've arrived because they are treated better than a lot of places in England and they get legal aid. But it's also because there's, to use that gold standard, it's a gold standard of services compared to where there is, say, in England. But dispersing children who have been traumatised and have quite often been tortured or they've been raped, or just the whole sheer idea of, being people smuggled across continents is, and then send them off somewhere on their own with no with no reference to their cultural backgrounds. I mean, it's absolutely disgusting.
Well, that's, I'm afraid, all we've got time for this evening. And thank you to both guests for what has been two fascinating conversations. I'll finish with something the French president said today, talking about the deaths in the Channel yesterday. He insisted on the need to act with dignity and respecting the spirit of effective cooperation concerning human lives. I don't think there's anywhere in the world where migration or asylum is treated with either dignity or the concerning of human lives to the extent that it needs to be. And that's something, just like violence against women, we should all take a responsibility for. On a slightly less somber note, can I just wish any American viewers a happy Thanksgiving. And please, everyone, it's Black Friday tomorrow. Rip up capitalism. Don't go. Spend local, buy local, and don't go mad at Argos. We finish as usual with our appeal that in order to keep Broadcasting Scotland going and delivering quality programmes like you've had tonight with interesting guests, it takes money. So please go online, have a look at the website www.broadcastingscotland.scot/donate and do that. Donate. Instead of going shopping tomorrow at Black Friday, there's what you can do instead. Shop with us. Give us some money to keep us going. We've a terrific studio here in Glasgow. In fact, we've 2 studios now. We've got a wonderful outside broadcasting unit. We've got a lot of things that we want to bring to you next year. It's been a great pleasure this night meeting you all. I will see you again on Sunday on the breakfast programme. Have a good evening.